All right, in this video, we're going to go over 2.2b, which is all about the difference quotient. The difference quotient is this formula right here, okay? We just want to simplify this thing for any f of x function that's given to us, okay? And to help us break this down, instead of just looking at this huge mess and not really knowing where to start, we're going to break it down into 3 steps. We're going to do a 3-step process for this, okay? The first step is just to simplify this first piece here. Okay, so first step, simplify f of x plus h. So whatever our f of x is, this is what we're putting in, okay? Putting in our function wherever there are, not there is, not they, oh my goodness, wherever there's an x, okay? So in our function, anywhere we see an x, we're plugging in this ugly quantity, okay? So step 1 is just to plug in ugly, okay? Then step 2 is we want to finish simplifying the top. So once we know what f of ugly is, then we need to subtract the original function. So that's what step 2 is. We take our solution that we got from step 1, and then we just subtracted the original, okay? Then once we have that answer, now we know what the entire top of this mess looks like. And our last step is to just divide it by h. So that's step 3. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at simplifying the difference quotient. So I'm going to go ahead and write the difference quotient down here just so that I can move my paper up. So the difference quotient is f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. So for this function, this is our f function. So it says whatever is inside our parentheses, we're plugging in for x, okay? So step 1 in simplifying the difference quotient is to just simplify this first piece, f of x plus h, okay? So notice x plus h is what's inside the parentheses. So whatever's inside the parentheses goes in for x. This function says to do 3 times my input and subtract 5. So I'm going to do 3 times my input and subtract 5. And in this case, my input is x plus h. Okay? And then we just simplify whatever we can do. Here, the only thing we can do is distribute the 3. So when I distribute the 3, I get 3x plus 3h minus 5. And that's all we can do here. Okay? So this whole mess right here is basically just simplifying this piece. That was step 1. Now step 2 says we need to go ahead and finish out simplifying this whole top piece of the fraction. So f of x plus h minus f of x, which this is the piece we just did in step 1, right? And this is my original function. So we take what we just got in step 1, which is 3x plus 3h minus 5, and we're subtracting our original function, which is 3x minus 5. 3x minus 5. And then we just do whatever we can to simplify that. So we distribute the negative, so we get 3x plus 3h minus 5 minus 3x plus 5. And then we see what can cancel out. Something should always cancel out on this step. If you don't have something cancel out, you did something wrong, okay? So our 5's cancel, and notice our 3x's cancel. So we're just left with 3h. So this basically is this top piece, right? And then our last step is to divide it by h. So we take the top piece, which was f of x plus h minus f of x, and we're dividing that by h. So we determined, right, in this last step that the whole top piece is just equal to 3h. And now we divide that by h, which leaves us with just 3. Okay? Not too bad. Let's look at doing the same thing again, but maybe with a little bit more difficult function. Okay, so we have our difference quotient here at the top. Remember, this is step 1. Then the whole top is step 2. And then step 3 is to do the bottom. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and start with step 1, which is to plug that ugly quantity into our function. So step 1, says we're going to do f evaluated at the ugly quantity. So look, we have a new function now. This function says whatever is inside our parentheses, that's what we're plugging in for x. And notice we have x in two places here. This says this function takes 2 times our input squared and subtracts our input. So where we see these x's, think of that as input. And our input that we're putting into this function is this ugly quantity. So we're going to do 2 times our input squared minus our input. And our input is x plus h. Okay, so now this is what we need to simplify. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this. When we have a quantity squared, that means we have that quantity times itself, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and distribute this negative into that quantity. So negative x minus h. And now I need to do a little simplifying. I'm going to go ahead and FOIL this out. So I have 2 times whatever I get when that's FOILed out. So x times x is x squared. X times h is xh. H times x is xh. And h times h is h squared. Minus x minus h. And then I'm going to go ahead and multiply my 2 into it. So I have 2x squared plus 2xh plus 2xh plus 2h squared minus x minus h. And then the only thing I can do from here is combine like terms. So I end up with 2x squared plus 4xh plus 2h squared minus x minus h. Okay? And this is my answer for this ugly piece here. Okay? So now that we know what f of ugly is, that was step 1. Now we want to go ahead and simplify the whole top. So we're going to take the ugly answer we got for step 1 and subtract the original. So step 2 is to take our answer from step 1 and subtract the original. Okay? Minus the original. So here's the answer I got from step 1. So 2x squared plus 4xh plus 2h squared minus x minus h. And now we're subtracting our original function, which if we look back up here, is 2x squared minus x. Okay? And now this is what we need to simplify to figure out what this whole top piece equals. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute this negative in. So I get 2x squared plus 4xh plus 2h squared minus x minus h. This becomes a negative 2x squared and a positive x. So once I get it all simplified out, now I want to see if I can combine any like terms. So notice I have a negative x and a positive x. I have a negative and positive 2x squared. And so what I'm left with is 4xh plus 2h squared minus h. Okay? So this is the whole top of this fraction. And then my third step is just to divide it by h now. So step number 3, f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. And our last step, you can see here, we got 4xh plus 2h squared minus h all over h. And then notice every single term is divisible by h, so I can reduce the h off. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and write it as if we factor out the h, because I want to make sure I know what I'm left with when I take that h off. So 4x plus 2h minus 1 divided by 8. Now that I've factored out the h, we can see what's left here, and we can also just reduce that h away. So our final answer would be 4x plus 2h minus 1. Okay? So it got a little bit worse, but maybe not the worst thing ever. All right, let's do the same thing for our function down here, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and switch colors just because I kind of almost bled over down in here. And I'm going to write my difference quotient down here. F of x plus h minus f of x all over h. All right, let me try one more, and then I'll let y'all try some. Okay, so new function. So whatever goes inside, notice this function says I'm going to do -1 divided by 4 times my input. Okay, so we're still simplifying this guy. Step 1 is to do f of x plus h. So step 1, f of x plus h. So this is what I'm putting into the function. My function says to do -1 over 4 times whatever I put in. So here I have 4 times x plus h. Okay. And normally we might go ahead and multiply that out, but I'm not going to right now because when I'm dealing with fractions, I like my denominators to be factored, especially since this is this first piece, right? This is this first piece. And then I'm fixing to subtract the original. So if I need a common denominator, I'd really like my denominators to be factored. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that. Move on to my next piece, which is to do f of x plus h minus f of x. So again, this is the answer I got just in my last step, and I'm subtracting my original function. So my answer from the last step, -1 over 4 times x plus h, and we're subtracting the original. And the original was -1 over 4x. And then notice here, I have double negatives. So that's going to become positive, right? So I need to add these two fractions. And right now they do not have the same denominator. So I need a least common denominator. Okay, for this denominator, I need a 4 and I need an ugly quantity. For this one, I need a 4 and an x. Okay, so that means altogether I need a 4, an x, and an ugly quantity. Okay, so I want to write both of these fractions with that denominator. So here I want to be able to write this as 4x over x plus h, plus here I want to be able to write this as 4x times x plus h. So I need to identify what each piece is missing, right? So on this first one, if I want my denominator to go from looking like this to looking like this, notice what I'm missing is that x. So I'm going to multiply here on top and bottom by x. That way my numerator, -1 times x, becomes -x. Okay. On my second term, notice if I want my denominator to go from looking like 4x to 4x times x plus h, I'm missing the ugly quantity, right? So I'm going to multiply by the ugly quantity on top and bottom. That way the denominator looks the way I want it. And on top, 1 times x plus h is just going to become x plus h. Okay. All right. So now I have them both written with the same denominator, so I can go ahead and combine the tops. So it's going to be all over 4x times x plus h. And notice when I combine across here, I have a -x and an x. Those are going to cancel out, right? Those are opposites. So I'm just going to be left with a positive h. Okay. All right, so what we have done, we're on step 2, right? This is the whole top of my difference quotient. So this is the whole top. Now we need to divide it by h. So step 3 says we're going to take f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. So this top part we just determined in the last step to be h over 4x times x plus h. And we're dividing that by h. Okay. Now when I say it's over h or I'm dividing that by h, that's actually going to help me simplify this a little bit because I have a fraction on top and on bottom I could write this as a fraction, right? I could write it as h over 1. And we know that this division line or this fraction line represents division, right? So I could write this as h over 4x times x plus h divided by h over 1. And then when we divide fractions, remember, this becomes a multiplication and we multiply by the reciprocal. So that becomes an h over 4x times x plus h times 1 over h when I flip it. And now I can go ahead and reduce my h's, and what I'm left with is 1 over 4x times the quantity x plus h. Okay? All right, so same process over and over and over. The simplifying may just look a little bit different if you have fractions versus polynomials. So on the next page, there are 2 for y'all to try. So go ahead and pause the video and give it a whirl. And whenever you get stuck, or if you're ready to check yourself, unpause the video and we'll go over it, okay? All right, so let's see how you did on number 1. when you plug in your x plus h quantity into this function says to do 6 times your input and add 2. So you're going to do 6 times your ugly quantity and add 2, and then distribute your 6 into the ugly quantity. Okay. Next step says to take your step 1 answer and subtract your original function. Your original function was 6x plus 2. You need to distribute the negative and combine like terms, which leaves you with 6h. So that's the top part of your difference quotient. Last step is to divide off the h. 6h divided by h leaves us with 6. Okay. If you need to go back over that slower, go ahead and pause the video. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to number 2. Same thing here. This function says we do 4 plus our input minus our input squared. In this case, our input is x plus h. So we do 4 plus our input minus our input squared. Okay, remember when you square a quantity, that means you're doing the quantity times itself. Don't just square each little piece. Okay, so this all needs to be FOILed out, which I wrote here what you get. And then because I'm subtracting it, that subtraction needs to be distributed to each term. Okay. And out front, there's nothing to multiply, right? Even though we used parentheses when we plugged in this x plus h, there's nothing outside of it or behind it that's being multiplied. So we can just drop those parentheses. So out front, we have 4 plus x plus h, which carries all the way down until we distribute that negative. Once we distribute that negative, notice we still have no like terms. So this is our first piece. Then our second piece says take that first piece and subtract the original. So here's my first piece, and then I'm subtracting my original. Make sure you distribute that negative to all 3 terms, which will change their signs, and then we should have some stuff cancel out. Okay. All in all, we should be left with an h, a negative 2xh, and a minus h squared. Okay. So this is the whole top of our difference quotient, and then our third step is to divide it by h. So we put our answer from step 2 in, divide it by h. When we divide off an h, that means we're going to be taking an h out of every single term. So just to make it a little bit easier, I went ahead and factored the h out so that I could see my first term would be left with a 1, second term would be left with a negative 2x, my last term would be left with a negative h. So once I cancel off that h, that is what my answer is. Okay. All right. So that is the end of this section, which is 2.2b. So you should now be able to complete that assignment in my math lab. If you have questions, please let me know.